Okay. Welcome to Exponential Chats, provided to you by Exponential Ventures. In this week's episode, we'll be talking about how to differentiate artificial intelligence from everything else. Understanding what is artificial intelligence and what isn't is a matter of growing importance today. My name is Adriano Marques. I'm the founder and CEO of Exponential Ventures, and today I have here with me Nathan Martins and Rhuan Silva. Before we start our discussion, let's briefly set the stage here. It's not news that there is an artificial intelligence revolution happening in the world today. Every single industry is now trying to harness the power of artificial intelligence to differentiate themselves from their competitors, reduce operating costs, increase profits, or improve efficiency. And that is just in the realm of commercial applications of artificial intelligence. If you haven't realized yet, the world is currently going through what I like to call the last arms race. Except that in this race, countries are not competing for arms or space superiority. They're competing for superiority in everything through the pursuit of ever more advanced artificial intelligence, until the first country gets to what we call the general artificial intelligence, immediately ending the arms race and starting a new era. We'll talk more about this topic in another Exponential Chats episode. Now back to commercial applications. We've seen several amazing innovations that are disrupting in industries. Virtual assistants, chatbots, sentiment analysis, image recognition, and self-driving cars are just a few ways that we're experiencing the encroaching of artificial intelligence in our lives, for better or worse. The point, however, is that companies have noticed that AI is the future, and adding AI to anything they do automatically puts them in a more advantageous position in the market. With AI, your product seems better, more competitive, more futuristic, and consumers are willing to pay a premium for it. This race for product superiority through AI proved to be much harder and costly than most companies were prepared for. So a few of them started to claim artificial intelligence, even though there are no apparent features that customers would perceive as intelligent. That's what we call fake AI products. Fake AI products are either completely lacking in AI capabilities, or the AI capabilities are irrelevant to the consumer. To make things worse, there is no agreed upon definition of what artificial intelligence is, and most consumers are not equipped to differentiate an AI-powered product from everything else. And when a product is intelligent enough to be clearly perceived as AI, it will soon become mainstream, and people will stop being impressed by it, and consequently, stop considering it intelligent. This is a well-known phenomenon known as the AI effect. People will rationalize that a manifestation of intelligence is not intelligence once they understand how it works or gets used to it. All of that doesn't change the fact that we need to be able to understand what is artificial intelligence and how to identify it wherever it may present itself. So here's our attempt to shed some light on this matter. How can I differentiate between artificial intelligence and everything else? So I'd like to start by asking you guys, what do you think? What's your opinion on this?
Want to start, Nathan?
Sure, I'll go ahead. So I don't think I have a strict definition, like textbook, what I think AI is. I think it's more like a general concept, and I'm more surprised when someone tells me, hey, this is AI, than when I figure it out myself. Kind of like if we were talking about the light in a refrigerator, when it turns on and off, is that intelligence? I'm more surprised if the definition fits that than when it doesn't. So to me, it's when you can't, as a programmer, I have a background as a developer. AI to me is something that you can't set up strict rules for, or that setting up those rules would take eternity. So if you're like, take a look at this picture and identify if it's a cat or a dog. If you're gonna look at each individual pixel, it'll take you forever and it'll only work for like a couple of pictures. And if you can create something that can do that by itself without hard-coded rules, to me, that's artificial intelligence. What do you think, Juan?
Well, actually, I think that I like your example, but I think that artificial intelligence is something that don't give precise answers and can change the answers along the time. Something like, okay, given this problem here, what's the solution? So the solution is this one. It's not the right answer, but it's a close to the right answer. Of course, I'm talking about heuristics. And in that case, I think that AI is also something that can evolve along the time. You provide more information for it, and then it gets precisely results, as we call the reinforcement. I think it's the reinforcement algorithm, isn't it, Adriano? Don't remember.
Reinforcement learning.
Reinforcement learning, right?
Yes.
All right. So, okay, not all algorithms use that, but I don't think that the refrigerator light has any intelligence on it. It's just kind of all right, okay, it's a sensor, the sensor triggers the light and on and off. Okay, but it doesn't seem like intelligence to me. It's just something dumb you do. You have a lot of sensors in your body and you react to them without even know it. Your brain do all the work. It's not smart. It's not intelligent. All right. Disagree with me, please.
That brings me to I did 1 year while I was back in college doing I think it was information management. I think the correct term is. And one of the first things that they talked about is how do you separate what is information from data. So if you have a bunch of weather points, so like today it was 21 degrees, tomorrow it's whatever, that's just data. But the second that you derive meaning from that data, it becomes information. I think it's kind of like the same thing of what you said about the sensors. Like if you have a sensor that can say on or off, that's just a sensor. But the second that it decides to take a decision regarding what that input is, to me, that's intelligence.
Those are all fair and actually assessments that you can find online if you look for what AI is. So there are completely different opinions on what defines AI. Some people say that it has the requirement of learning over time. Now, this is not observed on GPT-3, for example. And though you can provide it with context, it's going to learn within that. It's not going to learn anything within that context. It's just going to operate within that context. And if you need to learn anything, you actually need to retrain it, which is a manual operation that requires an engineer to do the work. It's not something that happens wherever it's being deployed. So we get into these definitions that are patchworks, work here, work there, but cannot work in both places. The closest definition that I can find is the textbook definition of intelligent agent. Now, intelligent agent is one thing. Artificial intelligence is something completely different. And here's the textbook definition according to Wikipedia. An autonomous entity which acts directing its activity towards achieving goals upon an environment using observation through sensors and consequent actuators. So in order to be considered an intelligent agent, it has the requirement of being autonomous. It cannot have a remote control. No human beings or nothing else can be controlling that entity and making the decision for it. It has to have a goal, and it has to be able to direct its activity in that environment by perceiving the environment through sensors and acting in the environment through actuators. Now, you're going to see that this definition actually meets a few other areas of computer science and technology in general. Yeah, this is not exclusive to computer science. But this is actually the definition that I like to go with when it comes to artificial intelligence. Now, I started by saying intelligent agent is not artificial intelligence. But why is it that I like to go with intelligent agent definition to explain artificial intelligence? I have another question for you guys to answer this one. So if you were to guess who among all of the animals is the most intelligent one?
I would say like chimpanzees or dolphins.
I said amongst all of them. What's the most intelligent one?
So are we included as animals or not?
Yes, yes, we are.
Um, I would say us then, humans, right?
Yes, yes. So when we're putting on a scale on all of the abilities that you have to present in order to be considered intelligent, human beings show the skills on all of those, or high performance in the vast majority of them. We don't have certain appendages that other animals have, therefore we cannot feel or behave like them. But when it comes to understanding ourselves, understanding others, learning, improving, performing arts, and all of that, we tend to scale above every other animal. And I'm not talking just about mammals. I'm talking about every single living thing. So to expand on that, what do you think is the dumbest animal on Earth?
Like worms?
The least worms, you said?
Bacteria? No, bacteria.
Okay, bacterias. Okay, that's a good one. I typically go with virus. I think they're kind of equivalent. If you're considering bacteria without cilia, it doesn't have those small legs to move around. I would say pretty close to a virus, but a virus is kind of like the rock bottom of what I consider to be intelligent. And reason being that it is in the border of what we consider alive. A virus is not alive without a host. But here's the thing. Once it gets to a host, it can sense the environment, it can attach itself to cells, it can reproduce and keep itself alive.
So are all computer viruses also intelligent agents?
Well, are they autonomous?
I don't think they can do. It depends on the virus, I guess. But if like the computer virus can only do stuff after it's connected to a host, I guess yes.
Right. Then once it gets into a host, infected a host, does it use any sensors to perceive where it is?
It probably consults APIs and stuff.
Or look into the file system. Where am I?
Yeah.
Is this a Windows? Is this a Linux? Is this a Mac OS? Am I in the right place? Is this the kind of host that I want to attack? And then once it realizes that, it takes action. So per se, it doesn't really have an appendage like a sensor that is like a light sensor or a switch, but it can perceive the environment it's supposed to interact with, and it can act in the environment it's supposed to interact with. So those are sensors and actuators. So yes, a computer virus is a form of intelligent agent. So what I learned was that if you try to measure intelligence by the ability of having a conversation like we're having right now, then the only animals that we can say definitively that they're smart and intelligent are the humans. And
but that's kind of like the Turing test, right? Like what you mentioned right there, like just by talking, that has like points of the Turing test where, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not 100% sure on this, but it's Turing, it passes the Turing test if you can talk to it and not identify it as a robot.
Right. So it is in part what I just said, but with the point that I was trying to make, and I'll go back to Turing, the Turing test in a second. But the point that I was trying to make is that if you try to put everyone in one measurement, in one scale, then you're going to have these gaps where obviously those animals have intelligence. Even plants, they have a certain level of intelligence. They are autonomous. They perceive the environment. They act in the environment to achieve an objective.
It protects itself.
Yes. So the point is that there is a sliding scale between a virus and human beings. And you're not going to observe all the same traits that we observe in different animals in all of them. So here, I managed to compile a short list of some of the traits that are used to measure intelligence between animals. So there is memory, there is arithmetic, there is remembering hiding places, there is ability to learn from other animals, ability to recognize itself in front of a mirror. And this is a test that is very controversial because how do you know whether the animal managed to identify itself in front of the mirror?
They say dogs can identify themselves, and I'm always like, how do you know? Can you talk to the dog?
So they
say he knows that it's not himself?
Right. The standard used is if the animal is in front, they typically put something on the forehead of the animal or somewhere it can touch or interact with that is not typical for the animal. And then you put the animal in front of the mirror. And if the animal can like initially think it's another animal, that's okay. But if this animal now tries to touch the item in his forehead or in his body, then he shows that this animal understands that he's seeing itself in the mirror. Now, what if the animal is seeing itself in the mirror and says, I don't care about this dot or this appendage in me. That's me, and I don't care. So that test is controversial because of that. Then you have self-control. There's this neat test they call the cylinder test, where you put a fruit or meat or food that is interesting to that specific animal, and you put inside a cylinder that is transparent. So if you do not understand the concept of a cylinder, you would go straight to the side of the cylinder and hit the cylinder and never get to your meal. So it would require you to try first and then figure out, okay, let me try the sides, and then from the sides I can get it. Right? That's another intelligence test that you can apply to different kinds of animals. And there is ability of using tools. So a long time ago, people said that what differentiates humans from other animals was the ability of using tools. And then we see monkeys, we see even elephants using tools, which is surprising to some people. But an elephant, for example, would use a rock or something to step on in order to reach something up higher than he can reach with his trunk. So that's the usage of a tool. And then some other ways is counting the number of neurons in the forebrain, counting the presence, the existence of spindle cells in the brain. There is the ability to plan, and finally, vocalization skills. We're going to see that if you look into any scale of intelligence amongst animals, you're going to see that parrots are typically going to come up high. Whales are going to come up high because they have the ability to vocalize and to some extent communicate. So if you think of all those tests that I just said, you can obviously think of animals that we consider impressive, intelligent, that would fail in every single one of them. I can share, for example, plants that are super smart. They follow the sun to increase their exposure, grow faster, and be more economical in their appendages and how they grow. So isn't that intelligent? Isn't that impressive? Right? But it would completely fail in all of those tests. So there is different levels of intelligence for natural intelligence, and there are different levels of intelligence for artificial intelligence. So that's how I like to go with it. Now, answering your question on the Turing test. So the Turing test is designed not to make the AI fail, but to make the human fail in the test. So the test is designed to have a human interact with a machine. Doesn't need to be a robot. There are different Turing tests, right? But typically, the initial one is just conversational through a chat. The idea is that you can fool the human to think that he's talking or she's talking to another human being, not to a machine. So that's the goal of the test. And then there are other levels of Turing where they try to do that with deepfakes, voice synthesis, and video, right? Those are harder because you require fooling the human being in different levels. It's not just text generation, text synthesis.
That's a good point. Jumping a little bit off of what you just said about detecting that, I wanted to also talk about deepfakes and kind of like the Deep Nude app that went out a couple of weeks ago.
Right.
We're entering an era where we have AI that's capable of creating these sorts of fakes where we know that they're fakes now, but I think given enough time and compute power, like in 5 years, or even today, if we have like a nation state, so kind of like if Russia wanted to really spend the money that they have on creating a video about Biden saying something that he didn't actually say and making it look as real as possible. I'm pretty sure they could do that today, and we wouldn't be able to identify it as easily.
Besides,
I don't think they try today, unfortunately.
say a lot of things.
Why not?
No, I was just making a small political statement. It's just that Biden has not been himself lately.
Okay.
So that's
No,
why.
but like I'm just generalizing, Joe, not in the context, but
Right.
what do you think, Juan?
Well, man, I think that this is one of the things I fear the most because we're always evolving security on that. Who knows? Who knows what's happening inside my house, inside the apps that I open on my cell phone? This is the real problem, right? This is the real problem with AI because it can adapt. That's the problem. What do you?
No, but like in terms of like deepfakes, like if somebody takes your face and puts that on like a porn actor, or if somebody takes your face and your voice and sets up a video of you like cheating on your wife or you killing someone.
That's exactly what I'm talking, because right now you are even giving you can give your statistics, your data to Google and to those great big companies, and they already know what's the frequency of your voice, because that's because your cell phone records everything you say in some minutes and send it to Google. That's how they make the voice recognition.
I don't think Google has like intentions of doing that, but if you take a look at what I mentioned, the Deep Nude, if you guys look it up, it was an app that you could download on your phone and you could give it any picture of anyone that you know, and it would take their clothes off. So this isn't Google, this isn't Facebook, this is the average person. This is your everyday Joe being able to, like, you walking down the street, take a picture of you, and then all of a sudden see you as if you were nude, or what the eye thinks you would look like if you were naked.
All right, I see this as a joke, so I wouldn't care about it.
But like, what about if that was your mom or your wife?
No, but
or your daughter?
That's the point. You should you can see that there's difference in that.
Right now we can, but
you can differentiate it.
So to Nathan's point, yes, it may be that in the future this is going to be so done to such a precision that it's going to fool most humans to believe that this is indeed an. Now it's sickening because the pains that you have to go through in order to train this kind of model is not small. It's not inconsequential. You don't do this in a weekend. So it's saddening to see that people really spend this kind of time and effort in order to develop this kind of technology. But the reality is that this is no different than everything else in the world. People will misuse technology to create bad things. And we're going to have to devise ways of curbing that. And there is a crime that is being committed when you send someone's nude and you claim that this is real, when you try to breach the privacy of a person, when you try to impute a certain behavior and a certain denigrating image to a person, then there is a crime being committed there, and that's what needs to be prosecuted. So I don't think that the fact that the deep nude exists at this kind of like puts a question into whether or not we should continue to pursue AI, right? There are going to be other more despicable uses of AI going forward than this, even if that is possible. But yes, I expect to be seeing despicable uses of AI in the future, but that doesn't mean that we should not continue to pursue it, if only to combat those bad uses.
So do you think that in that sense we should regulate AI or have like a code of ethics in that sense? Because like we as the builders of this technology, do you think like we should have some sort of regulations or some sort of like code of ethics that we should follow in order to not like, because the person that created that app, like today we know that it's a fake, but in the future someone can create an app that won't look fake at all. So do you think, what is you guys' opinion on that?
I think that this is a border that I don't want to cross, because when you start putting limits on, all right, now you cannot implement that app, now you cannot implement this algorithm. What's that?
So you think it's like a slippery slope?
This
So if once we do one, we'll just
no. This is the beginning of the end. You know, in that way, government will start complaining about everything you can do and everything you cannot. You lose your freedom. Is that fair? I don't think it's worth it.
I don't really believe in like that slippery slope that you mentioned. Like if we do one, then it's downward spiral. Because like I think given the correct law or the correct regulation, we can set up the correct context in order to do this. Like, okay, you can't create software that mimics other people.
Mm-hmm.
That's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see how that's a slippery slope. You know, what do you think, Adriano?
So it is in my opinion, I'm not in favor of regulation, because regulation implies controlling how something is done. And you're trying to control the execution of something in order to curb the side effect of it going forward. And I think that there is a much better way to curb the side effect or the unintended consequence if you just criminalize the act as opposed to try to regulate the execution of it. I think it's more efficient. And I think that is better to everyone who's making good use of the technology. Because when you regulate, you're imposing a burden on everybody to prove that they're developing something to the full extent of the required regulation. Now you add the burden to the 99.99% of everybody that does software just to curb the 0.01%.
But like, if I'm a mechanical engineer and I have the tools, I could technically build a flamethrower or a rocket and like cause all sorts of mayhem. And I'm not allowed to do that because of regulation. Like that's against the law.
Right.
So don't you think that applies to something like this as well?
Right. So there are certain places where regulation is required. And that is when there is a certain process and steps that needs to be taken. So for example, drug approval. You want to make sure that certain steps and protections are taken in order to make sure that this is good stuff. This is medication that is not going to cause cancer, is not going to kill the patient. And it's not just not kill the patient, but is effective. It's something that works. It's not just placebo, highly priced placebo, right? So there are some places where regulation is required. I believe that too. But when it comes to artificial intelligence, we're talking about a technology that we're having a hard time to grasp exactly how it works and how it's going to evolve. How can you come up with rules that are not going to curb the development of the technology or significantly slow it down? And that's how I see it. So let's just go back to the deep nude before you go. So I see that Marcelo Oliveira asked the question. He asked, because I said that of the deep nude and prosecute in the level of crime. He said, which crime is it that is committed when you put someone's face in a video or picture? That's a fair question. I do not think that there is, at least not in the US, there's not a law that says that you're forbidden of doing that. But if we want to curb this kind of behavior, the answer is not to go all out and regulate AI, is to criminalize the act of creating deep fakes with the intention of harming or somehow affecting the ability, the opinions of people, or the moral or the feelings of a person related to the image. So there is a way to criminalize this act, and that's what I meant by it. We can identify the problem. It was going through the aspect of talking about the criminal aspect of it. I was like, okay, so if there is the photo of someone being exposed in a deep nude, people are going to believe it. So there are actual consequences to the life of that person until that person can prove that that's not her or him. And how do you prove that? You now take a picture of yourself naked to say, hey, it's different. So there are damages being caused that fit in the criminal realm, and we can legislate for that. That's what I'm saying.
So in a similar vein, what about facial recognition? Because there are laws, at least I know here in Brazil, I don't know about the US, that you can't film someone without telling them that you're filming them in a public space. Like if you're in an elevator or a private place, you have to tell them that they're being filmed. And should there also be a law requiring you to tell them that they're being analyzed by a computer?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. So again, it goes back to being a burden. And when you put this kind of requirement, then you need to enforce. And now you have the government trying to enforce and the creators trying to comply. And not all cases are going to be the same. So I would think that wrongful use of facial recognition is what needs to be legislated. So if you're using this for some kind of criminal activity, if you're using this for against the explicit desire of the person being recorded, and there are some ways that you can go about this, but I don't think there's a way for us to legislate there either. Now, those are all interesting questions, and we're starting to see these in products, right? But I think that most people don't have questions about whether this is AI or not. If you see an app, this app can recognize your face, then it does have AI, right? Except that when you're using your phone and it's auto-focusing on someone's face, you're not in awe anymore, right? You're not surprised that it's figuring out where the faces are and figuring out focus.
Yeah, because like that's not something exclusive to cameras, right? To like smartphones, I mean, because like cameras had that like since the 2000s.
Right.
Where it's able to focus on people.
Is that intelligent?
In like a textbook definition, I would say yes. In my own definition, I would say it depends on the implementation.
Okay. So what would it require the implementation to be in order to be considered intelligence based on your standard?
It wouldn't, like I mentioned when I said my definition of artificial intelligence is this a generalized rule, or is this like hard coded to look for this shape and then this shape and then make a box around that? Or does it like understand a face? Does it know what a face looks like?
Okay. So is it necessary to know what it means to have a face in order to deliver on the autofocus feature that you would otherwise have to manually fiddle with?
That's a good point. Rhuan?
No, I'm lost. I like you on this one. It's because I must agree with Nathan in that case. I think everything depends. Not sure about.
Well, so like I said before, I like to think of artificial intelligence as in a sliding scale. And I use the intelligent agent definition because it's easy. If it's autonomous, doesn't have a remote control, if it has an objective and it can perceive the environment and deliver on that objective, then to me, it's a certain level of artificial intelligence. Artificial meaning that is not of biological nature, and intelligent meaning that, yes, it does have an objective, it does perceive the need to achieve that objective, understands the means by which it's going to achieve that objective, and achieves it.
Yes, in a sense.
It makes sense.
Camilla asked me the other day whether a remote control would be considered artificial intelligence. So, the same way that we don't have a standard definition for artificial intelligence, many different people are going to say whether or not they consider that to be artificial intelligence. There is certainly the comfort of being able to control your TV from your couch without having to stand up and go and press buttons behind it. But it is not artificial intelligence because it's not autonomous. Unless you press it, it's not going to do anything.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Now you can argue, okay, so if you don't turn on your camera, it's not going to recognize faces. But hey, When you turn on your camera, you have two options. Either you do the manual focus, or it's going to do for you. It's autonomous on that sense. It's not autonomous in bringing itself up, figuring out when the picture is going to happen, what position, and then taking the picture. It's autonomous in the sense where it was developed to execute the task.
Okay. And what would be like the difference between something like AI, because you already talked about intelligent agent, machine learning, and then deep learning?
Okay, so we have people mixing these up and using them interchangeably, and in some ways they can be used interchangeably. So you can call a deep learning model, you can call it artificial intelligence, but not all artificial intelligence is deep learning. You can say that deep learning is machine learning, but you cannot say that all machine learning is deep learning. And in the field of AI, you have several tools that you can use to achieve intelligence. There are several different techniques, including the famous if-else, the which clause. So all of those, yes, there are, well, mechanical Turk, different. That's more fake AI, and we can talk more about that in a bit.
Yes, because like you said, if-else, and I was like, okay, AI is just a bunch of if-else.
Yes, so it can be just a bunch of if-else, can be just a which clause. It can be something that just perceives the environment, the condition the environment, say, I'm just paying attention to the pH level of my plants, and upon achieving a certain level, I want to apply this compound to balance the levels. So that's pretty much if-else, or a which clause, if you want to use different compounds based on the different levels. So there are different tools that you can use to achieve intelligence. The reason why we're all talking about machine learning is that depending on the complexity of the problem, it becomes extremely hard to figure out a structured algorithmic way to solve that problem. So this is our attempt to have the computer learn how to solve the problem by exposing it to the problem. And exposing it to the problem may mean a lot of data, but it could also mean, in the case of reinforcement learning that Rhuan mentioned in the beginning, it also means just exposing the model to the environment in a way that it can control, respond, assess performance, and correct itself. And this could be also in form of a bunch of data. It doesn't necessarily need to be a robot in the world doing something. It can be just perceiving in the same way that we explained before. So here's how they're different. So AI is this overarching goal of producing intelligence in a non-biological way. That's how I would put it. In an autonomous, sensible way, achieving its objective that it was designed for through actuators in that environment. Machine learning is then the subfield of AI in which the computer learns by itself how to solve the problem. When I say by itself, it's not magical. You still need an engineer there to make some guesses, to make some adjustments, to figure out how that's going to come to fruition. It's not spontaneous. And then there is deep learning. Deep learning is a subfield of machine learning in which you have much larger models of neural networks that they manage to solve much more complex problems because of the sheer amount of perceptrons that this neural network has. Perceptrons would be the equivalent or our attempt of an equivalent of a neuron. So the more neurons you have, the more abilities or skills you have. It would correlate with neural networks. The more neurons you have and different structures of layers inside this neural network, then the more complex are the problems that you can solve. And I like to look at this a certain way. So when you look at neural networks, they're just essentially just huge mathematical equations. They have variables, they have weights, And when you bring a problem, you're essentially just filling all of that and calculating everything. And the result is going to be what you're trying to get. It's going to be a prediction. It's going to be an image. It's going to be some kind of product that you trained it to. And during the training phase, what you're doing is trying to adjust the variables and the weights such that with this input, you're going to get this kind of output. So that's how it is. You have that with typical machine learning, just plain neural networks. And you have the same thing with deep learning with much bigger networks. The difference is really just the size of the equation that you have to process.
So you mentioned something that's curious. I wanted to ask Juan and also you. You mentioned non-biological. So in a future where we can start to manipulate biological things to do computations, so let's say we can put together nano-organic robots, would they be considered AI or no? Would they actually be considered just intelligence? They wouldn't be artificial because they're biological. What do you think, Juan?
Well, man, actually, I think they will be considered just intelligent. I don't think they will be considered an artificial intelligence. But what do you mean about organic nanobots? Because nowadays we already have nanobots that you put inside your body to do a surgery, to do something like that. What do you really mean with that?
So I'm taking a little bit of creative liberties here. I read a book recently called Old Man's War, where to escape a couple of aliens, they created robots out of carbon and carbon-based materials. So it's not mechanical. It doesn't have steel. It doesn't have nothing that was made that wasn't organic, you know? So we're talking about completely biological parts, but we put them together and we basically gave them the intelligence, you know? Kind of like we would do instead of, picture like a regular robot, but instead of being made out of metal, it's made out of bones and blood and that kind of stuff. Would it be artificial?
That's a good question, because here's why. So remember I said that I like to use virus as the simplest form of intelligence as an example, because it is in the border of what biology considers alive. So what we consider to be biological is typically organic. It's made of carbon amongst other elements that we recognize as organic. So they produce proteins and they also can reproduce themselves.
Exactly.
When we're talking about nanorobots, they, in theory, can also reproduce themselves.
So now you're adding that reproducibility is also key to being intelligent or not.
Right. Then
So
we're going to go to...
robot can reproduce. What if it can make copies of itself?
Right. Now we're going to go to naturally occurring versus artificially occurring. So that's where I think the post is going to be moved to, natural versus artificial. And nanorobots are not natural. It's made by humans.
Okay, let me just put a twist in there. What happens if it's an evolutionary kind of thing where we just give it the initial kick and then give it like 1 million generations? Is that thing at the end organic, natural? Because it got there on its own.
Right. We're getting to the problems of the gray goose. Have you guys heard about this?
I just think I'm like moving the goalpost.
Yeah, I know you're trying to do that.
I just want to see where your limit is.
So let's just try to go the other way. So if say that we develop technology now with which you can replace organs with mechanical things and they work better. And now your heart fails, you put a mechanical heart. Your lung fails, you put a mechanical lung. And then all of a sudden, when is it that you cease to be natural and now you're artificial?
So that's like the Theseus ship, right? Where they take the ship and then you take out each part of the ship and put a new part. And then it's like the same ship, but it's all new parts, right?
Yeah, so this is called the soreness paradox. So imagine that you have a heap of sand. And you start and from this heap, you take a grain and you put it out. Is it still a heap? Yes. Then you take some more. Is it still a heap? Yeah, looks like a heap. And then at what point is it that you're going to take a grain and you're going to say it's not a heap anymore? Is it when it's just 2, 1, or when you take the last one? Is it when it gets to 10? So what is it that defines the line between a heap and not a heap anymore? See, so it's kind of like the same, even though a nanorobot could perhaps evolve and produce different versions of itself. In my opinion, it's still artificially created and artificially derived. So I would call it artificial intelligence. The same way that if I replaced everything inside me to continue alive, I would still call myself biological and naturally occurring. Not fully, but see what I'm saying? It's not a perfect...
I would call myself a cyborg.
Yeah, so yeah, you can say that, but we tend to see cyborg as someone that has, this is fiction, right? But we tend to see as someone with super mental powers as in addition to its physical abilities, right? So if you're a cyborg, then you have certain abilities with your brain that a typical human being wouldn't. That correlates better with the concept of artificial intelligence. But anyway, so the thing to me is that it's very hard to differentiate. But if you go from natural, artificial, naturally occurring, artificially occurring, that's an easier parameter to use to identify what's what.
So being biological has nothing to do with it in a sense, then basically, right?
Yeah, so biological correlates to naturally occurring.
Okay.
Strongly.
Okay.
So we consider biological to be naturally occurring, and that's kind of like an easier way for us with our language to make the distinction between one versus the other.
Okay. Cool.
I see that Marcelo asked another question here. He said, now it's going back to the deepfakes. He said, but will it be a crime if you put it on someone dancing or saying something he did not say? How can you explain that this is breaching your rights? So I think that, this is not clear cut. I think that there is damage that needs to be caused. If there is no damage, then
I think
that's probably
more
not a crime.
Intention. I think a word that you use that really sums it up is intention. So if I create a GIF of Juan dancing and put my face on it, there's no intention for me to degrade my image or his image. But if I think creating a GIF of him dancing or him saying something would denigrate his image, then that proves that my intentions were not good, and that can be something that a lawyer can use in court.
Right. And let's not forget that even though we might not have laws specifically designed for this and may not have for a long while, certain things are considered morally wrong. You're going to have repercussions if you do this. If you launch an image on the internet today, likelihood is that they're going to figure out who did it. And when they do, you're going to be exposed. So there are consequences if you do that. So you may consider not doing it because you don't want to have your reputation tarnished. You don't want to have to explain this every time you look for a new job. And you don't want to have this dragging for the rest of your life. So it may not be necessary to create legislation for it, say that we figure out a way to detect those deep fakes every time that they come. Then it's going to be a matter of just, detecting them when they're posted, and everybody's going to watch it as perfect as it can be, understanding that they are deep fakes. Now you're going to say, wow, now the government could take a real picture and say, this is a deep fake. And now we're talking about conspiracy theories, right? But I think that reality is, if we're thinking of today, that there are repercussions of whenever you make a decision that is morally wrong, people are not going to go along with it, and you're going to suffer consequences. Even though you might not face jail time, you're going to have real consequences in the world that you care about. And that's kind of my stance when it comes to deepfakes, voice faking, all of that, in my opinion, and used for cyber attacks and used in military operations. All of that, in my opinion, are potential uses that are harmful. But if you use with the wrong intent, you're going to face consequences. So the government can come up with AI for drones. If those drones make something wrong, the government is going to face the consequences for it. So if you misuse technology and it's intentional and it causes damage, then you're going to have consequences, even though there might not be a law for it.
But here's the thing where you were talking about the military, where it kind of gets a little bit fuzzy, at least to me, is you can tell intention if a human is pulling like a trigger. Let's say this is about a robot that, for example, let's take the Boston Dynamics robot. Let's say they take one of those, they put a gun on it, and they tell it, hey, you can decide who you want to shoot or not. And then they send it out to war. It doesn't have intent, or if it does, it's in a black box where we can't decide what that intent was. So how do we categorize something like that? Do we just pass the responsibility up the chain? So who's responsible for this robot? Was it the people who built it, or was it the government that used it? Or if the government was the one that built it, then it's the government. Either way.
Right. So two things here. So first of all, the government created this robot and said, okay, so you have the right to defend this perimeter. If someone crosses, you're allowed to shoot. Then someone crosses and he shoots. And now they figure, okay, this robot just shot a child that lost his ball. Right? So there are consequences. Just not talking about the thinking process of the robot. It's just talk about the consequences. This is going to be trouble. Whether or not we can justify the action of the robot, it's going to be trouble, right? So that's one of the reasons why governments are pulling back on that kind of development. Even though they're continually developing, they're pulling back on the deployment of those technologies. Now, to the second question, how do we understand the thinking process of that robot? So typically when we're training AI using machine learning, we fit a bunch of examples. And then we train, and once we figure, okay, this model has achieved the performance that we want with this model, we go and take this model and test with data that it has never seen before. We call it the test data set. And then you test, and then you figure, okay, so during training, I achieved 99% performance, but during test, which would be a simulation of the real world, I'm seeing 70%. And then say that this is a face recognition one. What you do as an engineer is you go and look at the faders. You look at the pictures and you see, why is it that it couldn't recognize the picture here?
Yeah, there are some kinds of AIs where it's just a black box. Like you're mentioning a few that we can actually look into, but like
we can look into the data that was fed, even though we don't understand why it couldn't recognize the face. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, so like I'm thinking about like cases like, do you guys remember that Facebook case a couple of years ago where they had to shut down the robots because basically Facebook created 2 chatbots and told them to, I think it was to discuss prices on commodities or something. And then the robots started optimizing the language to a point where they started talking gibberish to each other and only the robots could understand. And the humans were like, what's going on? And then they shut it down because they were afraid of it.
Right.
So I'm thinking about like those scenarios where you can't really understand what's going on.
Right. So that's a different case than the robot that killed the boy, right? So the robot that killed the boy, what's going to happen as the aftermath is that first the government is going to take the blame. Everybody's going to condemn, especially if it's a public failure. Everybody's talking about it. The government is going to take a hit. And then what's going to happen next is that people involved in the development of that technology is going to go back on the black box of that robot and take a look at the images that he saw. It's going to take a look at the inputs that it took and try to reason why would it take that decision at that point, and then justify backwards. So with the face recognition, we see a picture and we see, oh, okay, this one has weird lighting condition, or this one, the face is turned almost all the way. And then you start to think, okay, so maybe these cases I'm never going to be able to solve. Or this is the reason why it could not recognize. You cannot say exactly which perceptrons failed and where you need to change and tweak your model in most cases, but you get a sense of why it would fail. So when it comes to like assessing why this robot shot the boy, you would go back and you would look into it and you would say, okay, likelihood is that it was dark, lighting conditions were not good, the boy was running, the boy threw the robot, or the boy had an air gun, and you know, there are all of these conditions that surround the problem that could justify or not, could be just a plain failure. It was daylight, clear as day. The boy was walking, didn't menace the robot in any way, and it was still shot.
I see those points as technology points of security, as the same way I look to the Second World War. Like scientists have studied a lot and saw the point in which we could use the nuclear power. But they didn't want to use that nuclear power against another country. But in such case, Einstein sent a letter to Roosevelt at that time, and then they decided to drop the nuclear bombs the way they did. So here's the problem. The problem is not you to create a new technology. This is just my opinion, right? Not the universal truth. The problem, in my opinion, is not to create and invent and do something new. The problem is the way you use it. This is the problem. If you use it to do a wrong thing, you should be punished for that. And not the creator of the thing. Like getting back to the deep nude problem. This is the way I think. If you're using the app to do something that will probably harm someone, you are the problem, not the technology.
You're right, and I just want to go back and fix a few facts that you stated here. The letter from Eisenhower to Roosevelt was to create the Manhattan Project, and by the time that the nuclear bomb was dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Roosevelt was already dead. So the decision was made by Truman, which was his vice president. Anyways, but that still applies. So you still have someone saying, "I'm going to drop this bomb there." Someone had to fly this bomb and drop it on top of those cities. So it turns out that it's going to be the same thing for AI. The concern is that nuclear bombs, they're not easy to come by. They're not easy to produce. So you guys know how long it took Russia to detonate their first nuclear bomb after the attacks in Japan?
It was because they had like the spy that gave them everything, right? And it still took them.
Well, they had spies,
right? It was like 2 years, right? Or no?
I might be wrong, but I think it was 9 years. It still took them a lot to develop something that competes with it. You can fact check that while I keep going, and then you come back and tell me if I'm wrong. But what I'm saying is that we don't see the same thing happening with AI. You can develop very powerful AI, just using AWS from your basement and a FET check account. You can actually do that. And if you think about this, what would that make superpowers with access to huge data centers dedicated to AI processing? So it's now rather easy to come up with. 5 years?
4 years.
4 years. Okay. All right. So you're closer. You win.
But by 46, they already had everything in place. They just had to create the infrastructure around it.
Right. So what I was saying was the first detonation after the war. And it took several years, and there are still countries today trying to develop this technology, and they don't have access to it. So AI is different, and that's why I think that there's a growing concern around the ability of using AI and the purposes of using AI. I understand that. I know that it's a big challenge, but nevertheless, I think that regulation is rarely a solution for this kind of problem.
I don't know where I fall in that sense. Like, I know I was the one that brought it up, but it was really more to gauge how you guys felt, because I really don't have an opinion, because I tend to lean both ways. I think there are some cases where it should be regulated and some cases where it's not. Like a case where I say that it should be more regulated is that AI doesn't always do what we tell it to do.
Right.
There are several examples of that, like the cursed monkey hand. I know you also had a term for that, but it's like you tell the AI, hey, dude, collect stamps. And then it's like, okay, I'm just going to kill the entire human population because that's the way that I'm going to get the most numbers of stamps. That's kind of like the Matrix one, right? Where you try to make everyone happy by just killing everyone.
Right.
So there's some cases where I'm like, right now, AI is at a point like 2020. This isn't something that I would mess with in 2020 because of the year, but but like in the future where we have more powerful computers, like think about the DGXs and like the supercomputers that we have today and the supercomputers that we have in the past. I have in my house right now for a fairly low amount of money, a computer that 2 decades ago would take up whole buildings. And that's a pattern that I can see continuing and even like exponentially growing because of quantum computing and stuff we'll talk about in other chats. But in the future where we have enough computing power and we have smart enough AIs where we can tell it to do something and it'll do something completely different. So I think there should be rules in that sense because we, and I think as a whole, like computers and software recently, like in the past 20 years, has become an even more integral part of our lives, where the same way that civil engineers have to follow rules, architects have to follow rules because they build the stuff around us. I think the stuff that we build digitally should also have rules. So it can't be like a Wild West where anyone can do anything. I think there should be a set of regulations. I don't think we need government regulations in a sense. They can be like more like a governing body, kind of like they have here in Brazil. They call them regional. I forgot the term. So it's like a regional firm that creates laws around that. You know?
Yeah, there are all sorts of those everywhere, including here in the U.S. But again, it's easy to regulate on things that you can see. Yeah. Drugs, buildings, those are easy things. There are ways that you can deviate that are predictable that causes harm. When it comes to artificial intelligence, we lack that foresight. We lack that ability to assess damage and predict how it's going to be exactly employed to cause damage. So again, I do not disagree with all regulations. I just have a hard time finding a way to regulate AI in a way that would not hinder the vast majority of engineers and companies trying to innovate, while criminals are never going to abide by regulations anyways. So what is it that we're doing? See, so I think the crime is what needs to be punished. Anyway, so before we go, because we're almost 4 past the hour, guys, how can we differentiate artificial intelligence from everything else?
I'm gonna hand that off to Juan.
Yeah, I was not expecting you to do this.
Because I was the first one to give my definition. Now it's your turn.
Yeah, of course. Well, I think that how we can differentiate it, it's actually one of the things I would ask, but now we don't have time. It's nowadays with the current question: can artificial intelligence, like an algorithm of machine learning, create another algorithm of machine learning to do its job, something like that?
Now that's a different question, but here's how I would go about answering that specific question, the question of the live.
So another question.
Yes. So if you're a consumer and you want to see if there is AI in this product, think of it as an autonomous entity. Is it autonomous? Do I need to control it? Or can it perform its intended task by itself? Can it perceive the environment? Can it take with actuators take intelligent steps to achieve that goal on its own? Then I would say yes, it has artificial intelligence. Now, whether this is advanced or if it's limited AI, that's something that needs to be compared to other similar technologies. If we're talking about autofocus that recognizes just the location of eyes versus autofocus that recognizes the position of face with obstruction, you definitely know that, okay, this one is better than the other. So there is some comparison that's going to need to be made. Not all AIs are equal. So as a consumer, pay attention to those things. If someone is trying to push you a product and saying this is AI, the litmus test is whether it is autonomous, whether it can automatically perceive the environment with a goal, actuate in this environment, achieve its goal. So that's how you do it. And hopefully the whole live stream was helpful in giving you the tools to understand and assess that. And we're going to take that question of AI creating other AIs on another episode that we're going to have soon. Okay, Rhuan?
I just wanted to answer Marcelo. He said he didn't agree with the comparison about the construction. But think about it like this. We write software for everything, not just for logging into computers. There's software to run the elevator that you use every day. There's software in cars now. There's software in a lot of critical places where if it fails, it'll fail catastrophically and will kill you. So it's not just that you can't log in, it's because you'll die.
Yeah, we had the happy event of the U.S. returning to space exploration, launching astronauts through using the Dragon capsule to the International Space Station. That capsule is driven by software. So you would imagine what would happen if this capsule approaching the International Space Station would, by accident, turning their thrusters to 100% while approaching, trying to berth or dock.
There's actually a case of that with one of the Teslas. I don't know if you guys saw this a couple of weeks ago, but a Tesla just took the car on the freeway going like 60 or 70 miles an hour and just threw the guy into the wall, the concrete wall, and he died. And this has happened, I think, already 2 times in the same spot. So this is clearly like an AI bug where the AI thinks that the concrete wall is street and just throws the person there.
Right. So there are consequences of software engineering. But nonetheless, I think that Marcelo is trying to make the point on consequences. And then again, Tesla faced consequences for that problem. And they had to indemnify the family. They had to repair the issue. They had consequences. Not like, your fault. I don't have anything to do with this. There are consequences to that, independent of regulation. Now, what's going to happen is that when it comes to the time where we have the same kind of understanding and foresight that we have with civil construction, we have that with software development, then we might have the ability to regulate. But for now, I think it's not possible. All right, guys, we're 8 minutes past the hour, turning 9 now. I'd like to thank everybody that participated and watched us, and everyone that's going to come and watch afterwards. Please leave comment and interact. We're trying to help people understand those complex problems, and I think that it's very helpful when people bring questions and interacts with us. So thank you very much. Thanks, Nathan. Thanks, Rhuan, and we'll see you next week.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.